Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today we're gonna have a look at the Max Lange Defense, so the alternative to knight f6 on move 2 for black in the Vienna. What happens if black plays knight c6 on move 2? Well, this does a couple of things. Firstly, it copies white's moves, so every option white has, black has as a follow-up. One of the most important features is the fact that the f-pawn is free to move, and white in many cases in the Vienna game will want to play the move f4. There's the Vienna Gambit on move 3 immediately. You can play the Vienna Gambit within the Max Lange Defense again. And black can basically do the same thing, although black is a tempo down. So that's one main feature. The second feature is that this knight is no longer on f6, meaning that any Vienna Gambit type of position, which we would have gotten from here, we know that e takes f4 is bad in the Vienna Gambit. If you haven't seen my video on the opening, you can see it because white has to move e5 with tempo on the knight, and the knight has to move back because it cannot go to any of these squares. If black goes knight c6, the Vienna Gambit is slightly less useful because black can actually take it, and we're now in the King's Gambit, but delayed for one move, so white plays the King's Gambit on move 3 instead of the move 2, and in some cases we're going to transpose to the actual King's Gambit. Okay, so we're going to be looking at this. We're going to be looking at f4, the delayed King's Gambit, or the Vienna Gambit within the Max Lange Defense. We're going to be looking at bishop c4 for white as our sort of main lines. This is probably the best way to play, although if black at some point plays the move knight f6 and knows what they're doing, we are going to be transposing to the Stanley variation of the main line Vienna. I've made a separate video on that. So many variations aren't going to be covered here because I've covered them before. The same goes for pawn to g3 in the Max Lange Defense. If black at some point plays knight f6, there are many possible transpositions to the Mises variation or to the G3 Vienna. Again, I've put all the relevant videos in the first comment below. If you play G3 against knight f6, then I would recommend that you play G3 against the Max Lange. If you play bishop c4 against knight f6, then I would recommend that you go bishop c4 against the Max Lange. So we're going to be covering those. One move that we aren't going to be paying too much attention to is the move knight f3, because now we are transposing to the 3 knights, and this is just a completely different opening. Before we start with f4, I would like to talk about the move bishop c4, because this is what's most often played online and in lower rated games, and I think this is the most important thing you have to know. If you're not 2000, 2200, 18, 1900, if you don't play serious tournament games, or if you want to use the Vienna online, I think bishop c4 is the best approach, and I would just like to briefly show you why before we get into the theory. Now, as I said, knight f6 will just transpose to our mainline stuff. There are other possibilities. Black can play g6, I don't know. Black can play weird moves, and d6 is also possible. But by far, the most popular after knight f6, which is a transposition, is bishop c5, where black tries to copy what white is doing exactly. Now, we have the move, white is a tempo ahead because white played first, so now we have this move queen g4. And we're going to be covering the main lines for black when I get to the third part of this video, but I would just like to show you why this is a good approach and what most weak players are going to do. Now you have to defend g7. The best moves are king f8 and g6. Both of those are pretty hard for a weak player to play. So many people will play the move queen f6. And now black's in trouble. White is much better, and if black plays absolutely perfectly, they still probably aren't going to survive. So what we do here is we use the fact that we can double attack the queen and the c7 pawn with our knight. We go knight d5. We give up the f2 pawn, but that's no problem. Our king is safe on d1. Queen f1 is not checkmate. Now, if they don't take, what else can they do? Stockfish says take. I mean, it's plus 1.2 for white. If they don't take, if they go back, you just gain the free tempo, and you're going to take either on g7 or on c7. So we're basically attacking 3 points. When they take, we go to d1. And now the point. Two things are still attacked. What can black do? Well, black can go king f8, which is probably the best move, because now knight c7 is in check and g7 is defended. So we're going to have a look at that. Black can also go g6, which is absolutely losing. And the point is not to win the rook in the corner, it's to trap the queen. And in some engine lines, there are ways to give up a piece instead of your queen. There are ways to counterattack white's queen, but it would either require your opponent to have an engine after entering this position, or they'd have to be a genius. Even so, even if they find the best engine lines, they're still losing. So the point is not to take on c7. We keep this knight, we keep this threat. We go knight h3, and we try to trap the queen. Well, the queen can go to d4, and that's about it. If our queen is counterattacked, this is an interesting idea. You can always turn on the engine for these moves. Like this is, the engine says d6, which is pointless because the queen can move. If they go h5, for example, then queen g5. And again, knight c7, queen here. If they go d6, well, you just take and you win a piece. So the engine move is, as I said, sometimes the engine moves are going to win a piece for white instead of the queen. But let's look at some human moves. So let's say knight h3, the queen is attacked. Black sees that they lose a piece if they go d6. So they go queen d4. And now we simply trap in the queen. The queen has 0 squares. If c3 comes, then the queen is lost. So the only way for black to play is to move the bishop away and give the queen a square, or to counterattack white's queen. If our queen is counterattacked with h5 or with d6, we just move the queen away. Now again, there's pressure on f7, there's pressure on c7. If this knight moves away, then black is going to get mated. If they play bishop e7 to free up a square for their queen, again, we can just go queen f3. This is fine. Again, pressure here, there's the bishop, there's the queen. Now the engine plays b5 here, attacks the bishop, but it doesn't work. You can just take on c7 and after king d8 take on b5. So obviously this doesn't work. Black didn't lose the queen yet, but black is about to lose the game. Now a more human move after queen f3 is, let's say, d6, trying to develop a piece. Then we just go c3, queen c5, b4, and if knight d4 is the best move, because it is, the queen has 0 squares, then we just take the knight. And again, black managed to save the queen for now, but the queen's gonna be in trouble nevertheless. And there are many lines with queen f6 where after knight d5 they take on f2, you go here, and let's say they play king f8 instead of g6. Well, then again, we just go knight h3. King f8 is better than g6, and according to the engine, not completely losing. And it's not completely losing if black knows h5 and tries to chase our queen away. Then we go queen g5, they go queen d4, and after d3, this should be survivable. Let me see what it says. It says plus 0.8 if they find bishop e7 and then b5 and so on. The point is, if they go queen f6, they're probably going to lose the game, which is why I think bishop c4 is the best approach. Now, if they know the main lines, which I'm about to show you, you're still okay. We should remember that the Vienna, in most cases, is an opening that ends up being slightly worse for white, or in many cases, I should say. So if you go bishop c4 against the Max Lange, you basically are guaranteed an equal or a slightly better position, but you set up many traps black could fall into. All right, now let's look at the sort of king's gambit position. So e4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, and if you play the Vienna gambit, you can play this. This is fine. There's a downside, which I'm going to try to explain in detail, and the downside is that we are transposing to the quaid gambit in the king's gambit, which is extremely hard to play. So f4. Now, the idea behind delaying the development of the g1 knight is to be able to play f4, so why not play it? Well, as I said before, there's no knight on f6, so black can actually accept the gambit now. And declining the gambit is better for white. If black goes, for example, bishop c5, then we go knight f3, and now our position is perfectly safe. There are no queen h4 checks. There are no tricks. If, for example, d6, we go bishop b5, we're going to go d3, and it's an extremely pleasant position. because we have this pawn on f4. So for example, bishop g4, d3, let's say knight e7, we can go f5. The engine is going to say something about equal, but we have a ton of space. Black is never going to be safe on the king side. We have patterns like f6. This is very important. This should not be taken at any point, and so on. Other ways to decline the gambit, for example, d6, saving the pawn. Again, once again, knight f3, knight f6, bishop b5, and again, same plan, d3, castles, king side, and so on. When you get this pawn structure with c2, d3, e4, f4, you know that you have a good position because you've managed your main pawn break. So if the structure is facing this way, basically both sides would like to play f5 or f4 or f5. So you achieve that for no compensation for black. So black should take the pawn. Now, we go knight f3, and here's the problem. If they play something normal, we're basically in the Vienna Gambit, and we're gonna go d4. So for example, after d6, we go d4, we're gonna take the pawn back. If they go g5 now, then we have the move d5. And after knight e5, there's bishop b5 check, and this is a pleasant position for white. Black has weakened themselves too much for this to be viable. I'm not saying white is winning, but I'm just saying it's easier to play for white. However, black has a good move here, g5, and this is very, very similar to the King's Gambit. Let's look at this position and how we could enter it from the King's Gambit. If f4 here, black takes, knight f3, g5 straight away. This is one of the main lines of the King's Gambit. White goes h4 or bishop c4 or d4 or knight c3, which is the quaid gambit. And now after knight c6, hopefully you can see the transposition. Okay, so they go g5. And white has one move to keep relative equality. White's always going to be slightly worse, but it's going to be minus 0.4, minus 0.5. It's not going to be a big deal. So if you learn everything, you're going to be okay. However, it's very tough to play this. It's very easy to go wrong. You don't have an engine during the game, so it's highly likely that you're going to mess something up. Okay, let me show you the blunders first. First of all, d4 is losing immediately, and this is a pawn sacrifice or a piece sacrifice, most likely a piece sacrifice. Very good for online blitz and bullet, I would say. And again, this is the King's Gambit, so after g4, you go bishop c4, they take your knight, and now you either castle or take with the queen. So for example, castles, let's say bishop g7, queen f3, bishop d4, king h1. You can see what the idea is. The idea is to checkmate black. However, white is completely losing. So if black defends well, white's just going to lose the game. I'm not saying black is going to defend because it's not easy. But if black defends, then that's it. You're a piece down. You're completely losing. Another blunder, which is quite common, is h4. And now after g4, knight g5 is a very common attacking idea. Again, not good. Black goes h6, you take on f7. This is well known from the King's Gambit, not only in this line. And white continues d4. And you've given up a piece. The black king is wide open, it's naked. You have bishop c4 coming, you have queen g4, you have bishop f4. Black's best is f3. After gf3, black's best is d5. And this is the way to try and develop quickly. After knight d5, there's knight f6, bishop c4, king g7, getting out of the discovered attack by the bishop, maybe bishop e3, knight a5, here takes. Obviously white is worse. Black has an extra knight, but there could be trouble for black. So if you want to make things crazy, go d4 or h4, give up a piece and hope for the best. Now, I'm not saying you're going to lose. I'm saying you would lose against a very good player. The best move for white, though, that keeps relative equality in this position is pawn to g3. And this is the main move in the quaid gambit and the King's Gambit. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I just want to show you some main ideas and what the problem is. Black goes g4. You go knight h4 and black goes f3. Now, long term, this is tremendously painful for white to play around. Okay, there is a protected passed pawn on f3. I would never be brave enough to go into this. So my recommendation is don't play f4 against the Max Lange. If you want to, then okay, but this is what you're going to have to deal with. You go d4, you gain some space, they go d6, and now you can go bishop e3 or h3. I actually like h3, which is of course a pawn black should never take, because this is going to crumble. So if h3, just h5 is fine, and now you can go bishop f4 or bishop e3. So whether you insert h3, h5 is irrelevant. You can do it hoping that black takes. But let's say bishop e3, which is the main move. Knight f6, queen d2. Something like d5, e5 is very common. Knight e4, takes, and this is a position you can expect to get. Something like this. Of course, I'm not sure I can say white is worse. What does the engine say? The engine says minus 0.4. I would just say that I would never want to be on the white side of this because of the pawn on f3 and this pawn chain. I just think that any endgame is hopeless for white. Every middle game is hard to play because you have way fewer squares for your pieces. It's not even clear what this knight is going to do. Can you really afford to lose the g-pawn? I'd be really scared to go into this. Black plays something like queen d5, c4, queen a5. We trade queens, and okay, white has a good center. These pawns are moving forward, but again, no, I'm not a big fan. So against the Max Lange, if you want to go f4, you need to be prepared for this: ef4, knight f3, and g5. This is basically the King's Gambit. You can watch my series on the King's Gambit if you haven't, but you have to be prepared for crazy stuff. Okay, moving on, let's have a look at pawn to g3. So if you play like this in the main lines of the Vienna, if you play the Mises variation, then playing g3 against knight c6 is a good idea. Why? Well, some people are going to go knight f6 here, and knight f6 is very normal. I believe most people are going to go knight f6 at some point. So any lines where they go knight f6 are a transposition to the Mises variation. Again, there's the link to the video in the first comment below, as well as the link to where you can find the PGN on the Mises, on the Stanley variation, on the Vienna Gambit, and on the study for this video, where you can get the full PGN. So again, you have to watch that video to understand the transpositions. I'm not going to go over them again. So we're going to look at independent lines. There are three ways for black to fight against this. There's bishop c5, which I think is the most common move, then g6 and h5. h5 is an interesting idea. It exploits this hook on g3, and it makes sense. I mean, g3 is not the most active move on the board. Okay, now white really should go h3. If white does something else, then h4 is coming. And if black takes and trades off the rooks, I think that's good for black. Not better for black, but that's a good idea for black. And if you develop your knight, black can even consider the move h3, gaining even more space. So white goes h3, preventing the pawn from advancing forward, or at least giving himself the option to shut the position down with g4. And what's the point of h5, h4? Well, the point is that this knight is coming to g6. You're going to have to deal with the f4 square, which is now an outpost. There are no pawns on adjacent files that could challenge f4. And this structure is slightly compromised. Of course, you have f5 under full control, but if it ever happens, then your kingside is going to crumble. So castle kingside just became riskier. Okay, knight g7, bishop g2, knight g6. You have to defend f4. You don't want to allow knight f4. So knight g2. And now bishop c5. And the other knight is coming to d4. So again, you're going to have trouble with these two squares. For example, d3, d6, castles, knight d4. Okay, so, I mean, you don't have to take, but let's say you do take. Bishop here, knight e2. Again, you have to bring the knight back to cover f4, unless you want to give up this bishop, which I don't think you do. Let's say bishop b6. And white, of course, is fine. White ideally would like to play king h2 and f4 and get rid of this bind and get rid of the pin. But I think white should wait with that until the black king is committed somewhere. So you can continue playing on the queen side like a4, a5. Of course, the bishop is in trouble. You're threatening to do this. I mean, it's not a major idea for black, this idea to go h5. But I think it's interesting. If white isn't prepared, and if white relinquishes control over f4, it could be very dangerous. Alternatively, we're going to look at what happens if black just copies white once again. So bishop g2, bishop g7. This, of course, at least visually, is the safest way to play because you're just copying white. You could never be worse. However, the problem is that white goes f4 first. And since white goes f4 first, white, of course, has a slight edge. If f5 is played, then we get to play knight f3, and if they go knight f6 here, we can take ef5, bishop f5, fe5, let's say de5. If knight e5, we just isolate the pawn. So now you can see one problem. It shouldn't be a big deal, but if this is the best black can get after f5, like this isolated pawn position, with this pressure here, I'm not sure black should go for that. Of course, black isn't much worse. The engine says almost equal, but that's the reason you shouldn't go f5 against f4. So white is the first one to get this very logical pawn break in. Black should go knight g7. I think that's the best move. And this is fairly well known from many King's Indian positions. But black has something similar to the King's Indian. I mean, so does white, but okay. White goes knight f3, and you can already see that white's position is more active. The pawn is on f4, the knight is on f3. Black, of course, did not want to play knight f6 to block in the f-pawn. Black still has to play f5 at some point. So, for example, castles, and f5. And once again, fe5, fe5, de5, and maybe ef5. And after gf5, these are hanging pawns. They could be weak if they advance. I'm not sure they will be advancing. White is the one who has to provoke that. But as soon as they do, hanging pawns leave weaknesses behind. If one of the pawns advances to a dark square, the light squared complex is weak and vice versa. So black's job will be to use the pawns as space gainers that create outposts and control the fourth rank. And white's job will be to provoke one of them forward by putting enough pressure and creating weaknesses on corresponding squares. So, for example, bishop d2, normal developing move, queen d6, king h1, let's say a6, trying to play b5. White can start attacking the pawns. I prefer playing against hanging pawns, but that's a matter of preference. So g6, I don't think is as safe as it seems, because if you try to copy white and white is just quicker in doing everything both sides would like to do, then white has to be slightly better. Okay, finally bishop c5, that should be the main move. Okay, so bishop c2, and now it's possible to go a6 or d6. This we know from the Mises variation. If they go a6, you're not going to win the bishop on c5. If they go d6, you can take the bishop on c5. However, there's an independent line here. If they go d6 and you do go knight a4, there's something you have to know. This knight is, well, it's basically trapped if they go bishop d4 and you go c3. So now the knight has 0 squares, and white can take this bishop at some point, and black will be able to recapture the knight because the knight has 0 squares, and the forcing line is bishop takes f2. So, I mean, why not? King takes f2 and b5, and the knight is busted. I still think this is fine for white because black's going to have doubled a-pawns, but this is something you have to be aware of. For example, bishop d7, rook f1, rook b8. King g1, white has castled manually, black managed to regain the piece, and black is a pawn ahead. But it's a doubled a-pawn, and I'm not sure. Well, okay, first of all, white can take that pawn. and that's okay, but white doesn't have to take that pawn. White can also go for d4. But let's say you do take, and now let's say knight b4, putting pressure on the queen, something like this, queen a7. It's possible. This has never been played before. I just wanted to show you that black doesn't have to play bishop b6 and just give the bishop up. Black can go bishop d4 and provoke c3 and then take, because the knight has 0 squares. This is a pattern you're going to have to remember. So if they go d6, that's possible. I think it's much better to go a6. And now, of course, you don't play knight a4. It's pointless because the bishop has a square. You go knight g2. The reason you go knight g2 instead of knight f3 is, again, because you want to go f4. Okay, that's the main point of playing the Vienna instead of knight f3 on move 2. So black continues developing, we continue developing, knight g7, black would like to go f5. Okay, and we castle, black castles, we go king h1, and we want to go f4. Black goes f5, we go f4. This is the position you can expect if you go g3, if black knows what they're doing. Now, you cannot really say that either side is better. This is visually, and any way you look at it, it should be equal. The only difference in the two positions is that white's bishop is fianchettoed and black's bishop is on c5. Since the king is on h1, I don't think this is such a great attacking piece. And if the center collapses, this could actually be a great attacker. So if I had to choose, I'd choose white, because there could be some problems on the queen side. But then again, if black manages to launch a successful attack, then this bishop is going to participate. So who knows? So again, g3, if you play g3 against knight f6, play it against knight c6 as well. Okay, let's have a look at bishop c4. Now, black's best is bishop c5, sort of copying what white is doing. As I said before, d6 is slightly passive because the bishop is blockaded. Knight f6 transposes to the Stanley variation. Again, you can find the video and the link to the PGN in the first comment below and in the description. So we're focusing on bishop c5, basically the only good independent line. And now white can go d3. The line I showed you with queen g4 is just superior in my opinion. But d3 is kind of passive, and you're going to play it later on if black plays well, so why not throw in queen g4? It's not easy to defend. As I said, these are the two moves. Knight f6, of course, is immediately losing. We should not mention that even because, you know, everything is falling apart. Queen f6, we saw why queen f6 is bad, so let's focus on the two good moves. g6 is the main line. If king f8, well, mission accomplished. The king has been compromised. Black is never castling. It's not the end of the world for black. The engine says it's about equal, but why would you have a misplaced king if you don't have to? Queen f3, putting pressure on f7, knight f6 now works. And we continue developing. We're going to castle, we're going to go d3. The bishop may go to g5. It's a simple position with a weakness provoked. But most people, I think, are going to go g6, which is the main move. And now there are games here from this position. Probably the best game you should study is Nakamura Yu Yang-gi, where Nakamura won with white. And they were following this main line, queen f3, putting pressure on f7, knight f6. And this I've covered in the video on the Stanley variation. This is a transposition to something called the Vienna bishop hybrid. And again, I've talked about that there, but I just want to briefly show you what should happen. White again continues developing, black continues developing. So these moves are happening. Okay, d3 and knight g2. Now black can go bishop g4, but black doesn't have to go bishop g4. The alternative is h6, preventing bishop g5. But most people are going to go bishop g4 because it's a tempo. Queen to g3, and now bishop takes knight is popular and good. Alternatively, you can go queen d7, preparing to castle queen side. You can go bishop e6, challenging the bishop on c4. Again, I think h6 is okay because you're preventing bishop g5. sorry, not bishop f4, bishop g5, but bishop e2 is just cleaner, and this is what most people play. Okay, and now, for example, knight a5, black takes the bishop pair back, queen h4 is possible, threatening bishop g5, so there is no time for knight c4. If knight c4, then white is winning, so you have to do this. The queens get traded off. Let's say bishop d5, c6. And now again, there's a forcing line where you take on f7, is the same pattern as before, just with colors reversed. You grab the pawn on f7, and this knight is going to fall eventually. So bishop f7, king f7, bishop d2, the knight's attacked. And if they go b6, you go b4, and again, you win a piece. Now black throws in bishop f2, king f2, and again. And the knight now has to go back now that it has a square. So this has been covered in more detail in the video on the Stanley variation. So to sum things up, against the Max Lange defense, I would recommend that you go bishop c4, whatever you do, unless you want to risk it by transposing to the King's Gambit and playing f4, or the delayed King's Gambit. Or if you play g3 on move 2 in the normal Vienna, then do it here as well. One more thing, if you enjoy the 3 knights or the 4 knights, which I personally don't, then you can also go knight f3. Okay, thank you everybody. I hope you liked the video. Let me know what you think and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.